Thank you, thank you. Good to be here. Thanks for the morning discussion. What a stimulating to be together talking about these topics, and even more so to be together in person. Let me see. So this work that I'll be presenting today is joint with Bruce Weidick, who's also here. It's a continuation of work that we've kind of an agenda we've worked on for many years at this point. And this is going to be bigger picture, kind of a perspective piece, more than a particular empirical study. And so to give sort of the bigger picture motivation, this work is situated in trying to make sense of the role that hope plays in the human experience, especially in the face of intense suffering. And psychology actually got its start on this topic. As an economist, this is my sense of the evolution of work on the topic in psychology, really in World War II, right? So the ravages of World War II sparked this interest. So very well known, Viktor Frankl, his book, Man's Search for Meaning. Karl Menninger on the American side was one of the soldiers that liberated a concentration camp. And so I think a lot of what we know in psychology, or what we know of psychology, of positive psychology in particular, was born of these realizations that hope plays a role in the way that humans cope with really intense suffering. And so our starting point here has always been that there's sort of a similar level of almost existential threat to severe poverty that persists in many places. And so the work that we've seen in the last decade or so, emerging from development economists, that started with a handful who were incorporating measures of hope into RCTs and trying to understand hope as an outcome variable, or maybe as a multiplier. That you see that work motivated by something similar, which is like grappling with this question of what role does hope play among the extreme poor, among those who are destitute or despairing. So in this paper, in this presentation, our objective is to provide a perspective on emerging work, over the last, say, eight years or so, that follows that vein, and then having provided that perspective, to then to look forward a little bit and discuss potential frontiers of research. So this very much builds on, it's kind of a sequel to a paper that Bruce and I wrote 5 or 6 years. We wrote 6 or 7 years ago, that was published 4 years ago in EDCC. So the framework that we use for this is a hybrid of Amartya Sen and Snyder, who formulated hope theory. And so you can think of this framework as grappling with this question of how does hope shape human flourishing, right? Material prosperity may be a little bit too narrow, but how does hope shape human well-being, human flourishing? And it's a mix of, it's trying to think of the constraints in conventional inputs, constraints in internal inputs, and complementarities between those inputs, and then feedback loops. Like how do we learn? How do people learn about things like self-efficacy? So the Sen part of it is that it's a simple application of Sen's capability approach, which values freedom for freedom's sake, right? So the inherent value of having an expanded set of choices. The other thing that is prominent in Sen's capability approach are these conversion factors, right? So he conceptualizes conversion factors as these critical, they're environmental or they're social, but they're also internal, personal conversion factors that allow us to that determine how far resources go in translating into our choice set, into the capabilities from which we choose functionings, which are the actual doings and beings in Sen's word. One of the insights in that framework that's important is that external constraints on resources or on these environmental or social conversion factors, that these can become internalized with time, right? So these internalized constraints can lead to persistent effects, that live longer than the original external constraints that introduce them to the individual. Then on the hope side, so we use the Snyder's hope theory from psychology as a convenient point of departure. It's convenient because it thinks of hope as having these three elements: agency, aspirations, agency, and pathways. But it's convenient to economists because it does each of those elements, each of those hope components have an analog in economic models. Like there's sort of a micro foundation that you can find in modeling. And in Snyder's hope theory, he asserts that there are important complementarities between these components, right? So an increase in aspirations or in goals without also having some minimum level of agency or pathways is going to be insufficient to affect change. So the framework, my own commitment device, I put the framework there so small that I wouldn't be tempted to talk about it. Because that's what I need to do in 15 minutes. So, but a few of the insights there. One thing that we think is really important here is to understand which inputs are in a particular setting, which inputs are binding, which are slack. Another one is as I said, this kind of feedback loop idea of learning and updating and thinking of the self-confirming nature of these beliefs, of self-efficacy beliefs, for example. The last thing I'll mention on the hope theory, there's a critique that I've started calling the Peter Pan critique, which is the critique that believing doesn't always make it so, right? So the Peter Pan case is that you can't believe so intensely that you can fly, except that in some cases believing makes a big difference, right? So whether believing makes it so or believing makes a difference really has to do with whether there are other binding constraints, be them biophysical or monetary or other. The other thing I'll mention just on the openness to new experiences is that there's a big difference between adults and children here, right? So children tend to be, as we'll see in the empirical work, children tend to be much more impressionable, not surprisingly, and so these are things that are more malleable. You can think of hope as being a malleable conversion factor for children to a greater extent than for adults. So here's what we do we first survey this recent research across these three dimensions: aspirations, agency, and pathways. Aspirations, actually, some of you may have seen the World Bank. There's a World Bank working paper that was published last summer, Frutero et al., that does this for aspirations. So aspirations fit into economic thinking really quite nicely as subjective expectations or as reference-dependent utility functions, where you sort of draw a line as a goal, and that goal becomes a reference point. And we see this is where we see most of the research, right? So research in education, in employment, and enterprise, a lot of work being done in the last 5 or 6 years in development economics that studies mainly in education, but studies where these aspirations come from and what effect they have on performance or productivity. Agency has its roots in economic models implicitly. Anytime you write a max or a min, you're implying or asserting a degree of agency. But the work that you see empirically, the actual work that's done in applied settings, it really takes these psychology measures off the shelf, measures of self-efficacy or locus of control, and then looks at how those affect the adoption of new technologies or entrepreneurial performance. And then the last one, pathways. Pathways is sort of an inverse. It's inversely represented in most of our models in the form of constraints, right? So pathways is some sense, it's a little bit richer than that, but some sense that there is a feasible path to attain a stated or set goal. And this is where the case in the literature where we see this is really in monitoring and peer effect kinds of interventions, right? So this kind of coaching studies. This I'm not going to go through in great detail, but this is just to demonstrate, where we see, and this is sort of starting out as the broadest possible level, and then reducing these studies down to studies that try to exploit or leverage or introduce exogenous variation in these three components. Right? So as you can see, most of this work is really focused on aspirations in education. You see a fair amount in enterprise. Most of those enterprise studies on agency are actually in agricultural settings. So this is agricultural technology adoption. It's productivity, which we lump under enterprise. You see the vertical citations, which I don't expect you to be able to see, but you see where they are. Those are studies that actually do use something like hope theory to study as an outcome, as either an outcome or an input, to study the composite of agency, aspirations, goals, agency, and pathways. There's a few of those, but for the most part, these are studies in economics that treat these hope components in isolation. Okay, so from these studies, when we look across those various studies, there's a few patterns that emerge pretty clearly, right? And probably the clearest is that these hope-related interventions, we call them interventions because, as I said, those are studies that all try to exogenously increase the hope component. So these are, or try to leverage it. You know, there's a few instrumental variable studies in there, but trying to kind of leverage or introduce exogenous variation in these hope components. And what you see when you look across all of those is really consistently strong effects in education and much weaker, more mixed and context-dependent effects in employment and enterprise, right? The framework that I didn't go through, but the sort of thinking about how Sen and Snyder's theories collide, it suggests a couple of kind of likely explanations for this pattern. So this is kind of the meta-analysis part of the paper. One is that obviously the target beneficiaries are different, right? So education targets very impressionable children. They have malleable beliefs about their own self-efficacy. Another really key distinction is that the production function in education, especially in the way that these studies treat education, is very narrow and simple, right? The output here is often a test score. That's about as far as you get as a test score. So the production function for testing a test, or for achieving a given test score, is much simpler, much less stochastic, and so this mapping, the marginal mapping of inducing a bit more hope through time and effort and seeing productivity effects is obviously much stronger in education than it is in employment and enterprise. And then the last one, which is related, is kind of triggering these feedback loops. Right, so if we think of these hope components as the product of self-confirming equilibria, which I think they often are, children in education settings where a little bit of extra time and effort in preparation for an exam, that sort of direct and immediate feedback provides very clear feedback that allows the self-confirming equilibria to kind of emerge more quickly. Okay, so let me perfect. So this is the last slide. So this is then just like a few questions that I'll float to the room here, and happy to discuss in more detail. So one question that emerges here from our survey of the literature is complementarities, how we think about complementarities between these different hope components. From the work that Bruce and I did, we did this RCT with microfinance borrowers in Oaxaca. And one of the things we found there, because we were tracking all three components, that's intriguing is that we see a really immediate, quick burst in aspirations that then sort of fades fairly quickly after that. And that's in the 1 month follow-up. 12 months later, we actually see aspirations, or the point estimate is positive, but it's not significant. But we see the measures of agency and pathways actually sort of much more slowly sort of achieve a statistically significant increase. So those increases stick. So you see this kind of different paces in the responsiveness of these components. What we don't do in that paper, and what I don't think anyone's really done much with, is try to explicitly test for complementarities between them. I mean, are we, and it's a big question because most of the work in economics, I think, is treating these in isolation. So is that good enough, right? Or can we sort of safely ignore complementarities, interaction effects between them? We don't really know. as I said, Snyder asserts that those complementarities matter, but in the kind of settings that we work in, we don't really have evidence of that. Another question here is whether induced hope is different than innate forms of hope. And what I mean by that is that, so induced hope is like these different interventions that try to like move the needle on aspirations or on pathways. We in this Oaxaca study, we see some evidence that that innate hope is probably a little bit more potent. So we see like higher correlations with baseline hope than with the kind of induced hope that we generate through the randomization. So I mean, there's sort of intriguing in evidence that these are not the same things, right? Which makes sense if you think of the self-confirming nature of real innate hope, or hope that's kind of earned over years of experience. Another question is how weird hope theory is. What I mean by that is it's as weird in the Joe Henrich sense, right? So how westernized is this concept? It is very individualized, so there's no question. It's a very individualistic way of thinking about hope, and there's some intriguing alternative perspectives that emphasize the communal or the kind of the spiritual and emotional dimensions of hope that hope theory does not directly address. It's a cognitive theory of where hope comes from. The one thing I'll just mention there, one of my favorite parts of the World Development Report, the 2015 World Development Report, was this small study that was done internally in the World Bank, where they conclude, I won't get into the details, but they conclude that development professionals may assume that poor individuals are less hopeful than they actually are. Right? Part of that, I think, could be that our Western view of hope may discount the sources of hope that matter to the poor in other contexts, where the communal experience is really important, or where the spiritual experience is really important. And then I'll just end with this. This is the philosophical part. Frankfurt and Callard both talk about second-order volition, which is desires about desires, right? Our desires about desires. Callard, Agnes talks about proleptic reasoning, which is the aspiration for desires that we don't yet have, right? Aspiring to values or to worldviews that we don't yet have, and then trying to pursue those. Those are second order volitions, and I think in the case of poverty, especially ultra poor, escaping poverty is a transformative thing. It is an all encompassing change, and so I think we ought not underplay how big of a transformation that is, how much it may demand changes in our desires, and therefore aspirations that involve desires about desires. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Sam, in the back. In the back there.
Hi, thank you. This is really interesting. My name's Selena. I'm part of the Masters of Development Practice program. And I'm wondering if you made any the way that you're talking, it sounds like there was almost a distinguishment between these two terms without specifically calling them out, but between hope and faith, because they are different things. And like in my perception and what I've learned about hope and faith, faith is something that you talked about belief, but like faith is something that requires a belief component, whereas hope doesn't necessarily require a belief. So faith is something that's a bit stronger, and not necessarily faith in a religious way or even a spiritual way, but just faith as a concept versus hope.
Yeah, good question. So we don't, in this paper, we don't grapple with that too much, but the earlier paper, we do a bit, right? And so faith, there's an element of faith that I think is, we in the other paper call wishful hope. There's something, so we distinguish between hope that actually is operational or actionable, that like leads people to act, versus a hope that is a little bit more passive or even fatalistic. And those are clearly different things, even though we use the same word for them, right? So you raise a good point that like semantics here are tricky, because everyone knows what it feels like to them to feel hope, right? But then they may not express it in quite the same way. They may not articulate it in the same way. So it's a good point to keep in mind that semantics, and there's a lot of neighboring concepts that clearly are related, but are also distinct in some way.